Thanks for clicking. Canada's high levels of immigration will put a floor on real estate prices. This according to a new report from RBC and nearly every commentator over the past few years.
I'm not the bad guy here.
And at first glance, it appears to be a reasonable assertion. With demand exceeding supply, all things being equal, prices are going to rise. And this line of thinking has translated into a recent poll showing that Canadians believe that housing will remain unaffordable due in large part to immigration. And this notion has no doubt been reinforced by a recent CMHC study showing that Canada needs 3.5 million new homes by 2030 for prices to become affordable. Yet, what does the data actually say? Is Canada going to bring in enough people to prop up demand for a real estate market that is showing major signs of a slowdown? So what I want to do today is go over how we traditionally measure housing demand, take a look at how well supply and demand dynamics have done in preventing historic housing corrections, and then discuss what to look for next. Speaking of next, we are going to have a much better idea of the state of Canada's real estate market when September's data is released in a couple of weeks, and we'll obviously have an update out on that data on this channel. Click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, let's get into housing demand. First up, demand. Specifically, how do we measure it? According to a recent affordability study by CMHC, housing demand is influenced by the growth in the number of households, income per household, and by interest rates. So, aggregate housing demand, total demand for housing, is determined by how many households we have that want to buy houses and their ability to buy them via income and interest rates. And while we have a good idea of how income and interest rates are measured and how income and interest rates can affect real estate prices, or at least we should by now,
and I've learned a lot.
Let's take a brief look at how we measure demand relative to supply, the housing gap. Scotiabank, in a widely cited, widely referenced report in 2021, noted that the most simple and informative method of measuring the housing gap, the shortage of supply relative to demand, is by measuring the total number of housing units available relative to population. And it makes sense. If you have more units available relative to the size of the population, the supply gap is going to be smaller. So a country or a city that has 500 units available for 1,000 people is going to be much better off than a country or a city that only has 400 units available. And it's not only Scotiabank that uses this method to measure supply and demand. The federal government's budget has used this method to demonstrate a lack of supply in Canada, as has the OECD. And if it's good enough for Scotiabank, the federal government, and the OECD, it's good enough for us. So, what is the current state of housing supply in Canada relative to demand?
It's horrible. Horrible.
In the Scotiabank report that we mentioned, they noted that Canada has the lowest number of units available per 1,000 people in the G7. The widely cited report actually got the numbers wrong, as Canada has 427 units per 1,000 compared to the US's 422, but it's close enough for our purposes. So, is that level of demand, 427 units per 1,000 people, not the worst in the G7, but also not the best? Is that level of demand enough to stave off a major house price correction?
Oh yeah, of course.
Let's take a look at 3 examples. In 2011, the US had 424 units available for every 1,000 people, a little bit worse than Canada's 427 that we have right now. And, as we all know, the US underwent a major housing correction in between 2008 and 2011, losing over 20% of its average house price. So, the US had very similar supply issues that we have right now, not to mention 0% interest rates, and still underwent a 20% house price correction. And I know what you're saying. That was an outlier case. That was the US in the wake of the global financial crisis, which was precipitated by the subprime mortgage crisis, where borrowers were given initially low adjustable mortgage rates, which shot upwards after the borrower hit their reset date, leading to payment increases of almost $3,000 in some cases.
Yeah.
So let's take a look at Toronto's real estate correction in the 1990s. In 1989, Toronto's average price was $274,000, and by 1996, it had dropped to $198,000, a nearly 34% drop from peak to trough. So, what was Toronto's housing gap in the 1990s? Midway through the correction in 1991, Toronto had 2.275 million people and had 865,000 occupied units. So that was about 380 housing units available per 1,000 people. Much less than we have right now. Fast forward to 1996, and Toronto had 4.26 million people and 1.5 million available dwellings, or 350 units available per 1,000 people. Much worse supply issues than we have right now, and prices had dropped over 30%.
No to me.
So, the US in the wake of '08 had the same supply issues that we have right now, and prices still flopped. Toronto in the early 1990s had worse supply issues than we have right now, and prices dropped over 30%. Why is that?
It's the economy, stupid.
Well, yeah, we're all aware of the economic downturn that the US underwent in the aftermath of '08, and in Toronto, in Ontario for that matter, in the 1990s, we saw a major recession and economic downturn brought on, at least in part, by interest rate hikes. And it makes sense that the economy and interest rates would trump supply. If you have 10 houses and 50 people, and 45 of those people lose their jobs, chances are prices are going to drop. And we can see this not just in the US and in Canada, but also if we look at New Zealand. New Zealand has more supply problems than we do, having 379 units available per 1,000 people as per their central bank, and was mentioned on that same OECD list along with Canada. During the pandemic housing boom, New Zealand was coupled right along with Canada with having one of the frothiest housing markets in the world, but as of May of this year, has now underwent a crash for the ages, with prices down 17.5% as of May. So, we have the US in '08, we have Toronto in the 1990s, we have New Zealand as of recent. 3 different countries, 3 different time periods, all of which had equal or worse housing supply issues than Canada has right now.
That's how you do it.
Now, back to immigration. According to CMHC's projection, by 2030, Canada is expected to have 43 million people, with a projected housing stock of 18.19 million, which works out to 423 individuals per 1,000 units, which is similar to what we have right now, better than what Toronto had in the 1990s, and better than New Zealand has right now. Further, judging from 2022's demographic data, new immigrants aren't exactly prime buyers, with the median income for immigrants 5 years after arrival being $29,800, enough to purchase a home worth roughly $120,000.
And get the f*** out of my office, you understand?
Now, all of this isn't to say that rising immigration, that low supply levels won't at least help prevent a major housing price correction. It's not enough to stop it.
And get the f*** out of my office, you understand?
Rising unemployment, which the central bank is trying to cause, increased mortgage servicing costs, not to mention higher inflation, as we've seen today, are stronger than any increase in perceived demand coming from an increase in the population.
I'm what counts out here.
As such, when you see article after article and you hear expert after expert saying that immigration will put a floor on Canada's prices, we need to ask why. How? What are the mechanics? Are these experts just citing perceived common sense without actually looking at the data, which worked out so well for variable rate mortgages? Which data are they looking to that shows that population size relative to housing stock can prevent a real estate correction, can prevent a real estate crash? As we saw today, 3 cases, 3 time periods, 3 countries, housing supply was not enough to stop a major real estate correction. With that said, we'll get a much better idea of the state of Canada's real estate market when that data starts trickling out in a couple of weeks, and we'll obviously have an update out on that data on this channel. Click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, thanks so much for watching.